I can see that people are still slowly coming into this webinar, but time's getting away from us, so we might get underway. And to kick us off today for our first Critical Public Conversations webinar of the year, I'd like to introduce Wurundjeri Elder Tony Garvey to welcome us to country. Tony. Thank you so much, Tony. It's been a feature of our webinars, first as the Indigenous Settler Relations Collaboration and now as the Australian Centre over the last 2 years, to always have a welcome from a Wurundjeri Elder. And it's been incredibly important, I think, for us as a team, but for everyone zooming in, that we are still grounded, we are still reminded of our place on your country, and we still honour you and your family and your ancestors, and pay our deep gratitude and respect to you for the care and love that you show to this beautiful country. Thank you, as always, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks,
Tony. So welcome everyone to the first 2022 Critical Public Conversation Series webinar. Our theme this year is Undoing Australia. A couple of quick housekeeping mentions before Julia and I introduce ourselves. So there's no chat function for today's webinar, but there is a Q&A function, and there'll be time at the end of this session when Julia and I have finished to take some questions. So please type them into the Q&A function whenever you're ready. You don't need to wait till the end. We don't have live captioning during this, but you can generate your own closed captions through the Zoom functions. And when this recording goes up on the Australian Centre website, it will be captioned at that point. So that's all of the housekeeping. I'll introduce myself quickly and then Julia can introduce herself. So my name is Sarah Madison. I'm a professor in politics here at the University of Melbourne, and I'm also the director of the newly formed, or reformed and relaunched Australian Centre, and I'll say a bit more about that in our remarks shortly. I'm a white settler woman. I live and work at the moment on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, which is an honour and a privilege. Julia.
Hello everybody, my name is Julia Hurst. I am a lecturer in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history at the University of Melbourne in the School of History and Philosophical Studies, and I'm a Deputy Director of the Australian Centre with Sarah. I am an Aboriginal woman who has connections across Darug and Dharawal land. Our history is, my family's history is one of movement and connecting to culture with intimate experiences of the stolen generations. I was born on Wadawurrung country in Geelong, and I would like to pay my respects to all Aboriginal people who are with us today, ancestors as well.
Thanks, Julia. I'm just sharing my screen. There we go. So as mentioned, today is the first of our Critical Public Conversations series webinars for this year and as the Australian Centre. And today we respond to the question, how should we tell the truth about Australia? And this is to open this year's conversations, which focus around the theme of undoing Australia. And we're going to tackle this question in 4 parts. So first, I'm going to begin with an opening consideration of the idea of undoing and the implications that this has for truth-telling. And Julia will then draw out what we know of some of the First Nations aspirations for truth-telling, including how truth is being linked to treaty as a form of hoped for relational transformation. I'll then outline some of what we might learn from historical and international experiences of truth-telling before Julia concludes with a consideration of whose truths risk not being told in oh my goodness, sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble driving all of my things here. Who trues risk.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you quickly. You've stopped screen sharing.
I don't know how I did that. That is absolutely mysterious to me. All right, there we go. That's sharing now though, yes?
It's sharing, but you've just got to click on presentation mode again. Yep, we're all good. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, good-o. I don't seem to be able to see my notes when I do that though, Bianca. Sorry, Ellie.
No worries. Would you like me to try sharing?
Yeah, if you could share the slides, that would be great. For some reason I can't have both things happening right now. So while Ellie gets the slides back up, and my apologies, I will just stop sharing. I am going to keep talking. So I'm going to begin with a consideration of what we mean by undoing Australia. So as this is our first Critical Public Conversations webinar as the new Australian Centre at the University of Melbourne, we wanted to take a couple of minutes to explain our approach and our ambitions, because obviously our name is quite problematic to us. In our expression of interest to take on the directorship of the Australian Centre that we wrote last year, we wrote, and I'll quote from it, "The continent we now know as," sorry, my notes have gone again. "The continent we now know as Australia is a colonial construct. Born of invasion and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, Australia does not exist except through its occupation of Indigenous lands, its imagination of its own political sovereignty, and its domination of First Nations. As much of the globe still reckons with the legacies of colonialism, so too must Australia grapple with what it means to be an occupying force and consider what must be done to inform, shape, and give life to more just relations between Indigenous and settler peoples." What we tried to make clear in our proposal is our critical understanding that at the most fundamental level, this place called Australia does not really exist at all. For millennia prior to British invasion, hundreds of sovereign First Nations have lived carefully and responsibly on this continent. And these sovereign nations are still here. Mere moments ago, in the context of deep time, Europeans arrived and claimed this place as their own, and over the following century, invented and imposed and imagined sovereignty and constructed the institutions of this place that we now call Australia. But this place called Australia remains a construct, a fantasy, the making of Australia as a nation with a singular, undivided sovereignty, as a white nation, as a legitimate nation state in the global order, is not an irrefutable, uncontested, or natural fact. It is an idea that is created, invented, asserted, and done every day. And as such, potentially, it might be undone. Next slide, Ellie. Undoing, however, will require a peeling back of the layers of so-called Australia. The labour of this peeling back, this undoing, has been the work of Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists, writers and scholars, including historians like Julia and political scientists like me. In my 2019 book, The Colonial Fantasy, for example, I tried to articulate some of the lies that those of us educated in the Australian school system were taught. That this so-called Australia began as a penal colony, with the territories acquired by the British subsequently revealed and mapped by explorers, populated by squatters, and made rich off the sheep's back and in the heady days of the gold rush. First Nations barely featured in this narrative, at least in my education, and when it did, it was as a curious footnote to the story of the birth of a new nation. The territories invaded by the British were treated as though they were terra nullius, with the violence that was done to First Nations peoples recounted as an unfortunate but inevitable chapter situated in long ago history. And in this story, the idea of Australia as a colony ended at federation, when the 6 self-governing British colonies united as the Commonwealth of Australia with the terms of their new federal relationship outlined in the Australian Constitution. And although I would hazard a guess that most of the people who have zoomed in for this conversation today would see these lies for what they are, the uncomfortable reality is that the majority of the Australian population does not agree. For most people resident on this continent, the idea that Australia is a fiction that might be undone is entirely beyond the scope of reality in which they have been raised, socialised, and educated. And so this is where truth-telling may come in. One of the questions that interests us concerns the role that truth-telling might play in deepening public understanding of Australia as a colonial project, and relatedly, what might be done to transform relationships between First Nations and the Australian state in light of these truths. Truth commissions seek to end denial about the impacts, effects, and extent of systematic and historical violence, challenging accepted understandings of the past by establishing a shared historical record of past violence and abuses. The testimony of victims of specific harms is used to reconstruct an official narrative of a country's violent and repressive past in an effort to restore the national community. But while it may be true, as some scholars have argued, that truth gathering can help to prevent a recurrence of the injustices of the past, if these injustices are as narrowly defined as they often are in these official processes, the impact of historical truth is also constrained. And as Paige Arthur has acknowledged, to date, truth commissions have not made much of a difference on issue of Indigenous self-determination and political rights. We too remain unconvinced that the outcome of truth-telling in this place will be the kinds of transformations that many imagine. And there is some reason behind this scepticism we carry. First Nations and settler states may pursue truth-telling processes for quite different ends. What First Nations seek in these contexts is most often not a transition towards a shared or integrated society, as is the case in transitional justice contexts, but a transformation of that society such that their sovereignties as distinct and self-governing peoples are more appropriately recognised. While Indigenous peoples may be seeking to reopen a conversation about contested sovereignties and self-determination, governments may try to use these same measures to draw a line through history, taking responsibility for human rights that it now wants to emphasise are firmly in the past. This is markedly different to the desire of First Nations, who may see transitional justice as building not a wall, but a bridge, using measures like truth commissions to draw history into the present and to draw connections between past policy, and present injustices, highlighting the complex ways in which present policies reinscribe historical justices and relations of oppression. So in Australia to date, although there has been no official process labelled a Truth Commission, there has been processes such as the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal children from their families, and the work of the Council on Aboriginal Reconciliation that have each contributed to efforts to deal with the past by investigating forms of historic and ongoing violence. The inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, for example, received written submissions and oral evidence from Indigenous organisations, government representatives and former employees, church representatives and NGOs, including confidential evidence taken in private from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people affected by the policies and from adoptive and foster parents. The Bringing Them Home report included harrowing evidence of the forcible removal of Indigenous children that it charged constituted an act of genocide contrary to the UN Convention on Genocide. The historian Peter Reid describes this accusation of genocide as opening a hornet's nest. Next slide. And herein lies one significant problem with the idea that knowing the truth will transform political relationships. On the one hand, it is clear that the bringing them home findings did indeed influence efforts to transform Indigenous settler relations. Although the issue of child removal had not been seen as significant enough to warrant even a mention in the preamble to the Australian reconciliation legislation, following the release of the report, it became central to the reconciliation process, opening a new space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experiences of abuse and suffering to enter the public domain. The 2008 apology was an eventual acknowledgement that these experiences had been heard and believed. Indeed, knowledge of the stolen generations is the only publicly accepted, although certainly not by everyone, narrative of significant wrongdoing towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. On the other hand, however, the process of truth-telling that produced the Bringing Them Home report also unleashed the history wars. Critical historians met sharp resistance from a public that had been schooled in a comforting and deeply ideological story that downplayed the violence of colonisation. Conservative historians found a new platform from which to argue that critics of Australian colonial history were doing nothing more than advancing a black armband view of history. This view was taken up by former Prime Minister John Howard. If you're all just quietly booing and hissing, that's okay. When he argued that, in contrast to the black armband view, by his reckoning, the balance sheet of Australia's history was dominated by what he described as heroic achievement. Howard's intransience ensured that the impact of Australia's most concerted effort at truth-telling was contained to the symbolic recognition in the eventual apology to the stolen generations. And this 2008 federal government apology was addressed specifically to members of the stolen generations in what we can understand as an effort to draw a line under a shameful aspect of Australia's colonial past without transforming or even acknowledging the structures of the continued colonisation of First Nations territories. Yet, if a Truth Commission wants to contribute to Indigenous peoples' self-determination and political rights, then it must put these individual human rights violations in their historical and social contexts, taking care to explain how, for example, a lack of self-determination created the conditions for state-led human rights abuses. Next slide. Victoria has now created the Yoo-rrook Justice Commission, which describes itself as the first formal truth-telling process into injustices experienced by First Peoples in Victoria, with the mission to investigate both historical and ongoing injustices committed against Aboriginal Victorians since colonisation. Queensland and the Northern Territory have also signalled that truth-telling will play a significant role in their emerging treaty processes. And these processes build on the recommendation in the 2017 Uluru Statement, which called for a Makarrata Commission that would supervise agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. As Appleby and Davis contend, the demand for truth in Australia is explicitly linked to hope for political transformation. Truth, it is hoped, will offer a way to understand what is at stake in future relations between First Nations and the Australian settler state. So how might truth-telling undo Australia? What hopes are still held for this work? Next slide, and over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about hoping for truth and transformation. So let me continue. So despite the very mixed outcomes from Australia's early experiments in truth-telling, and despite the fact that it is hard to imagine a future exercise in truth-telling that would be more substantially transformative in the way that so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people desire, a need for truth-telling is still seen as a necessary step prior to a constitutional reform or as part of a treaty negotiation. Megan Davis reports that during the Referendum Council dialogues, in region after region, this word truth came to the fore. The dialogue spoke of the wound caused by the silencing of the Aboriginal experience after the arrival. In North Queensland, they spoke about how their ancestors saw Cook, telling one another with smoke, yet the history books still say he discovered us. frontier wars, massacres, and forced racial segregation on reserves and missions are not commonly known by fellow Australians. Some spoke of statues being erected to honour early Australian explorers, one in North Australia holding a gun to commemorate the opening up of the frontier for the telegraph line, while the descendants of the massacred families suffer only sadness and hurt at having to see it. They spoke of the sensitivity of these one-way commemorations of Australian history. Stan Grant has echoed this call for truth-telling, suggesting that while in the past he was cautious about such initiatives, concerned that they might harden division, today he is of the view that Australia needs this mirror into our soul, a full reckoning of our nation's past that may set loose the chains of history that bind this country's first and today most miserably impoverished people. For Davis, this is the only way to restart a meaningful reconciliation process. She suggests that reconciliation in Australia has stalled because it failed to do what reconciliation should do, and that is talk about the truth. The desire for truth-telling as a pathway to political transformation is certainly evident in Australia. Appleby and Davis contend that the demand for truth in Australia is explicitly linked to hope. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, they suggest, are not just seeking clarification of facts or recognition for victims. They are calling for truth-telling as part of a political transformation in which the relationship between First Nations and the Australian state is fundamentally renegotiated. Mark McKenna's 2018 quarterly essay confirms such a view in asserting recognition, the Republic and truth-telling as the key elements of the new constitutional settlement. Linking truth-telling to treaty only emphasises such aspirations. But no project of truth-telling in Australia will be straightforward. The dense historical entanglements of Indigenous settler relations have created complex dynamics and relational exchanges that alter both selves and identities. Some historians explain these dynamics as a crazy quilt, producing opaque dialogues whose narratives need to be found and entered into with care. In my work, however, these dense historical entanglements, combined with narratives of survival of those people first impacted and who are now experiencing cultural resurgence, who state they are yet to find their historical and contemporary belonging and are in danger of being dismissed, delegitimised, forgotten and silenced by history all over again. If treaty is to tell the truth, it must reflect the lives of Aboriginal people, irrespective of traditional owner status. Indeed, Aboriginal people have all been impacted by history, and our everyday lives and ways of knowing reflect this diversity across the state. Is a certain way of knowing history and everyday experience better, more authentic than the other? We should be mindful of the legacy and the tension that history has set up for us as treaty processes develop. And in this critical framing of truth-telling, ask ourselves who and how Aboriginal history narratives have been made and indeed controlled in the past. Is history and treaty only looking for one truth or many and indeed new truths? I want to know who belongs to treaty. Mission and reserve histories, intergenerational trauma, low socioeconomic and health status, cultural resurgence, families finding their way home, histories and experiences of not belonging, and indeed of having no history and cultural breaks, are all legitimate and important histories that intersect, clash and run parallel to truth-telling of uninterrupted sovereign Aboriginal families and nations. Since 1788, the colonial experience has not stopped. These stories cannot exist in isolation to one another. To be transformed then, I wonder whose voices and stories are yet to be told. And is history and treaty only looking for one truth or many? Is a certain truth more valuable than all the rest? Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks. And next slide, Ellie. So-called Australia is, of course, not alone in trying to develop institutional mechanisms for reckoning with historical and contemporary injustice. Many nations have attempted to address historical injustice through processes of public inquiry and truth-telling. Since such processes first came to prominence in the 1990s, they have been variously lauded for their capacity to provide new forms of justice for victims of historical violence, and condemned for failing to live up to their more transformative aspirations. In recent years, it has become increasingly common for these kinds of transitional justice mechanisms to be developed in the hope that they will address particular aspects of historical injustices that lie between settler states and Indigenous peoples, although this application is not always or ever given the label of transition. To get a bit technical about it, truth commissions are temporary state-sanctioned inquiries that typically last from 1 to 5 years and are intended to investigate particular events and examine a specific series of violations over a defined period of time. They are often led by high-profile figures with a respected human rights record. Their work usually involves collecting testimony from victims and sometimes from perpetrators. And that language of victim and perpetrator is very common in this field. And they're usually supported by a team of investigators and other staff. Conceptually, truth commissions tend to be complex political and moral enterprises that both invoke and recast history and law. The vast majority of research into truth-telling processes is found in the transitional justice literature. And within that field, truth commissions are variously thought to develop the beginnings of a language of reconciliation, to create a new collective memory, to establish a historical record of political violence, to offer a basis on which to build a shared history, to establish new norms for breaking the cycle of retaliation and violent conflict, to generate authoritative historical accounts, and issue recommendations for institutional change, and foster a more inclusive democratic dialogue by providing official spaces for previously marginalised or silenced populations to share their stories. The emphasis you will have heard among these analyses is on reconciliation, on shared understanding, and on authoritative or official accounts of historical wrongs. And Julia will pick up some of the concerns around this emphasis in the final section of our presentation today. These transitional justice approaches to truth-telling are only marginally relevant in settler colonial societies like Australia, where the illegitimacy to be addressed is not a lack of liberal democracy, but rather the foundation of it, the act of settlement and colonial dispossession. A settler state's response to the demand for justice through truth-telling is thus dependent on political and popular views concerning the extent to which the foundational constitutional settlement can be reopened. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there is considerable resistance in settler colonial regimes to reconsidering the foundational settlement of a modern settler state, particularly with regard to the ownership of land and the persistence of Indigenous sovereignties. So before we return to what might be needed in so-called Australia, let's briefly look at two international examples. Next slide, Ellie. Perhaps the most famous Truth Commission of the past few decades has been South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has seen many hundreds of thousands of words of text devoted to its analysis. From the outset, the TRC was controversial in its use of conditional amnesty, a process intended to create a third way between the extremes of either Nuremberg-style trials or blanket amnesty. Although never intended as the beginning and the end of South African reconciliation efforts, it was certainly understood as such by some observers. Often the TRC was presented and at times represented itself as engaged in a process of once and for all coming to terms with the horrors of apartheid. The South African TRC has, however, been critiqued for the narrow definition of violence, violation and abuse that it adopted, which was generally restricted to those transgressions that were already a crime under apartheid, rather than focusing on the wider structural crimes of apartheid. The Commission addressed only victims of gross violations of human rights, thereby avoiding the public recounting of the everyday horrors of apartheid that were legal under the regime. This had a deep silencing effect by depicting ongoing poverty, marginalisation and inequality in South Africa as merely a landscape against which more serious offences of murder, torture or disappearance took place. In one recent reflection on the South African TRC, Sisonke Msimang observed that today many look back on the process as a carefully managed stage show, a piece of theatre concerned with the appearance of truth-telling rather than the substance of what truth actually means. Yet, a bit as we saw with the Bringing Them Home report, despite these evident shortcomings, the final report of the South African TRC undoubtedly contributed to the emergence of a new, more widely shared collective memory on which the South African nation has since based its ambitions for a stronger human rights culture. Through its own moral authority, the Commission's most valuable contribution has been to hold up a mirror to South Africans, showing them a deeply troubled society, a society torn apart and distorted by the obsessive politics of white supremacy. Not a transformation in and of itself then, but a new discursive frame that anchors ongoing debates about justice. Next slide. Outside of these contexts generally understood as transitional, like the South African example, truth-telling processes have also begun to be used as delayed response to past human rights violations against Indigenous peoples in settler colonial societies, most notably and recently in Canada. The Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission advanced a clear political commitment to the transformative potential of truth, which emerged from the 2006 Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. The Canadian TRC, which held public hearings between 2008 and 2015, sought to inform all Canadians about what happened in Indian residential schools and made 94 calls to action addressing legacy issues, focused on redress for past harms, and reconciliation issues, which were focused on the future. And there remains much optimism in Canada about the transformative potential of these calls to action, which are being taken up by a range of public and private institutions. Calls to action 43 and 44 in particular have resulted in the passage of both federal and British Columbia legislation that provides a roadmap for the full implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the first such legislation in the world. Yet there are also critics who suggest that the Commission framed what happened to Indigenous children in residential schools in part in terms of overcoming a sad chapter in Canada's colonial past, rather than enabling recognition of colonialism in the present. As with other government-initiated processes, the terms of truth-telling were set by the Canadian state, determining in advance, as it were, what truths might be known. Nevertheless, as Rosemary Nagy has since argued, while the TRC was by no means perfect, it did serve as a catalyst for the ongoing unsettling of colonial beliefs and attitudes and the restoring of settler narratives in response to what was witnessed. Nagy argues that research, teaching and social movements will continue to be informed by the TRC's work, and who can say what transformations might yet arise from this engagement. Next slide, and back to you, Julia.
Thanks, Sarah. So one of the more concerning statements about the role of the Yoo-rrook Justice Commission in Victoria is its ambition to establish an official record of the impact of colonisation on traditional owners and First Peoples in Victoria. Many high-profile truth commissions have established themselves with the goal of seeking a singular truth, despite the fact that violent histories, including histories of include histories of invasion and colonisation. As Brenna Bandha argues, many versions of reconciliation maintain a demand for one version of historical truth to be agreed in order for society to agree to restitution and move on. The reality, she contends, is that history is a compilation of different threads of memory, threads that are intertwined but also in conflict, meaning that the idea of a single shared truth about the past is nothing more than a fiction. The kinds of truth-telling we pursue at this moment of time in so-called Australia should perhaps not focus so much on the discovery of one truth, but on how accommodation between conflicting historical accounts might be attained in order to make a conflict more livable. In my work as an oral historian, I have heard countless times of storytellers describing how alone they feel in their history and experience. What they're saying to me is that they don't feel included in history telling, that they don't fit into the narratives of Aboriginal history that have been made available to them. And here we must question and be critical of the making of history and the making of treaty. But all of that, of course, is for another time. In saying this, I do believe that there is a great need for a diversity of Aboriginal truths and histories to be told, which will lead to a diversity of ways of knowing each other. These are the experiences that exist between Aboriginal people, not just between Aboriginal people and the settler state. The risk, however, is that truth-telling in Australia will again skew towards a nation-building agenda, despite the fact that nation-building has always been the cause of historic injustice towards Indigenous peoples, not the solution to it. It was precisely in the name of building modern unitary nations that injustices were committed against Indigenous people, stripping them of their lands, cultures, and self-governing institutions. As previously argued, Indigenous peoples are rarely seeking from truth-telling a transition towards a shared integrated society, but rather are often seeking a transformation, reconstruction, indeed an undoing of that society, such that their sovereignty as distinct and self-governing peoples may be practiced without interference. One of the alleged merits of the Commission approach, as opposed to more strongly justice-focused approaches such as trials and criminal tribunals, is their contribution to the healing and recovery of victims. Where trials focus on the motivations of perpetrators, commissions are more focused on the feelings of victims. Victims are supported and enabled to tell their own stories of atrocity and injustice, framed from their own perspectives and recognised as legitimate sources of truth with claims to rights and justice. The focus on victims creates a different relational experience when compared to a criminal procedure. Commissions allow for the excavation and expression of raw emotion of fear and anger, painful struggle, defeat, and survival. There is more to history, however, than a history of victimhood in the colony. So we have to ask, who are we truth-telling for? Ourselves as Aboriginal people, for the benefit of the settler state, for catharsis and healing, or to move towards a more truthful future? One of the key dynamics of settler colonialism is the settler desire to locate colonialism in the past as a terrible but necessary process that has now been completed through what might be identified as a moment of political break. This is what non-Indigenous political theorists Elizabeth Strakosch and Alyssa McCoon describe as the vanishing endpoint of settler colonialism, a desired moment of completion that is forever pushed further into the future. There is a significant risk that the re-emergence of truth-telling as a political dynamic in so-called Australia will be another moment of an imagined political break with the past. To avoid this, we need to resist the discourse of an essential truth with a beginning, middle, and end that is descriptive of an authoritative and official account of history. Our history is always being made and built finding its foundation as generations of people find and know their connectedness. Archives remain closed and people are only just beginning to speak up. Meanwhile, the whir of history can be heard as the state rushes to make history around us. The story is always the same, silencing us, writing us in or out, and controlling our voices via shame, disconnection, trauma, and administration. Sure, we have survived and we will continue to do so, but there are more than 800 nations of Aboriginal history in Australia, and we must protect our diverse experiences and futures. Our history must, by necessity and in truthfulness, remain complicated and unfinished.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you. And thanks for driving those slides, Ellie. Sorry for that technical hitch. We've had one question come through on the Q&A function already, but please start typing away. We've got about 10 minutes to get through a few questions. So the first one here is from Ashley, says, recognising that there are many Aboriginal Australian languages, is there an Indigenous name for Australia in the way that the current Māori name for New Zealand is Aotearoa? Julia, you might have some thoughts on that. My understanding is no, because there are several hundred languages on this continent, although we do lead the world in Indigenous language loss still. There are many names, many place names that the several hundred Indigenous nations, First Nations of this place have. And it's great to see that those names, those languages start to find their way into the public realm a lot more. The ABC now, you know, you'll hear journalists on the ABC say that they are coming to you from Naarm. They will use the country name, the correct country name of the place where they're from. They'll say they're on Wiradjuri country or Wurundjeri country. Patricia Karvelis is pretty diligent about that, but I think it has also become official ABC policy to do so. The Australia Post will now deliver mail that is addressed to, you know, so-and-so on Wurundjeri country. So I think that's changing, but we won't, I can't imagine a time where we would end up with a singular name for this continent that would erase the multitude of nations and languages that exist here. Julie, do you have anything to add?
No, I think it's that there are multiple place names for different places, depending on how people are connecting to them and how they connect to other people as well, as being water places, as being hunting country. There's a lot of different layers of place and country that we need to be mindful of.
Another question here, it picks up, I guess, some of what I was perhaps alluding to through my own framing and the work that I've done on agonistic dialogue, or the agonistic democracy, the idea that that differences of opinion are not something to be avoided or erased, but are actually constitutive of healthy democratic life, and that dialogue has a role to play in that, particularly around truth telling. And that also, I think, speaks to, Julia, your argument about there being multiple truths, and the idea that we have to resist this call towards a singular truth. And I think what people feel anxious about in that sort of framing is that there'll be disagreement, that there'll be tension, that there'll be differing versions of reality. And for some reason, the idea of success in all of this is to achieve a singularity. Julia, do you want to say a little bit more about why you think that pull towards singularity is so dangerous?
Yeah, you can tell that I have been wondering about this question for a while. And I think that in order for our histories to keep growing and to keep expanding and to reflect our lives as Aboriginal people, we do ourselves a disservice creating one truth. We are all complicated people with complicated histories and layers. And I think that in the past, these major tropes of history making do silence people and do make people step away from their histories and from their lived experiences, from the work that I've been doing, talking with people about their oral histories. So I think that history has a role to play in creating these complex conversations. And I think that Australia as a state would really like us to be uncomplicated, easily boxed, easily fenced in. And I think we should desperately walk away from that type of control.
Yes, Julia, you and I have reflected on the timing of the Victorian government's recent announcement of a small reparations payment to members of the stolen generation in Victoria. The timing of that just before the Yoo-rrook Justice Commission begins its work seems a little uncomfortably like an effort to bracket those experiences and to say, we've dealt with those. This process is about is linked to treaty, and it is linked to the treaty process in Victoria. And so does that mean this is only going to be a truth-telling process for recognised traditional owners, and how will those complexities be able to be heard in, what is quite a short process, 3 years that Yoo-rrook Commission has to create this official history. And I think you and I share a lot of anxiety about what silences might be forced into that process. A question here about South Africa. Someone says they're curious about the South African TRC as a global model for truth-telling. Is there any critique about how this process failed to consider the role of global capitalism and reparations for continuing racial injustice? Well, there certainly is in South Africa, where that's still a very live conversation. And I think that although it is widely, the TRC is widely regarded as having opened up new conversations in South Africa and holding up that mirror to South African society, particularly around some of the worst violences of apartheid. It is also understood as part of a settlement agreement between the ANC as the incoming government and the outgoing white supremacist South African government of the apartheid regime. And what's often referred to as the great U-turn in ANC policy saw them walk away from their socialist principles that had always been a part of the ANC's manifesto and embrace neoliberalism. The fear was that tackling white capital and its role in apartheid would see what they described as white flight, would see white multinationals leave South Africa and leave the country even more impoverished. But the upshot of that has been that although there has been a political transition from apartheid to democracy, the economy in South Africa is still very much an apartheid economy. And the role of those corporations in profiting from apartheid has not really ever been held to account. And you can see what's at stake there. The late wonderful Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was, of course, commissioner on the TRC, called for a 2% wealth tax as part of what ought to come out of that Truth Commission, as a way of I guess, funding reparations for those white multinationals that had profited from apartheid. And there was an outcry, an absolute scandal. There couldn't possibly be this kind of imposition. So it's certainly true that global capitalism in South Africa, but everywhere, continues to profit from human rights abuses and has yet to be held to account in terms of paying reparations for the continuing racial injustice that they perpetuate. Oh gosh, goodness me, that was a long answer when we're nearly out of time. I'll take one more question. Oh, look, this is one that Julia and I talk about, and the team talk about a lot. Considering the challenge of undoing Australia, what might be an undoing name for the Australian Centre? So this Jane suggests that she does this by using a small a for all words deriving from Australia. Oh, Jane, you've hit the nail on the head. We're so uncomfortable with our name. When we put in our EOI, it was called the Australian Centre. And though our very critical project was accepted by the university, we were told we couldn't have the scare quotes, as they were called, around the word Australia. The chair of our advisory board, Ghassan Haj, has suggested we could build on a tradition that's common in Europe, a radical political tradition of writing the word Australia, but with a line through it. I also like the idea of using a small a. These are, rest assured, we continue to wrestle with this question. We don't yet have an answer beyond, I guess, every time we use the name of our centre, expressing our discomfort with our own name and trying to signal the fact that it is a problematic, the concept of Australia is a problem, and we hope to continue to wrestle with that problem through our existence. Julia, do we have any final words from you before I make sure to mention the next critical conversation?
No, Sarah, over to you.
Okay, I'm sorry I didn't get to more of your questions, but thank you everyone for joining. Our next critical public conversation will be on the 6th of April, where you'll get to hear from the wonderful Genevieve Greaves and Amy Spears, who are presenting on their work on public memorials and public art, public decommemoration of Australia. We're really excited about that. They've been working on an edited collection in the Springer series, Indigenous Settler Relations in Australia and the World, that Julia and I edit with Sana Nakara. And their webinar on the 6th of April, Counter Monuments, Challenging Distorted Colonial Histories Through Contemporary Art and Memorial Practices, promises to be an absolute cracker. So please do join us. Thank you. There was well over 100 of you Zooming in today. We really appreciate your attendance and your interest. We really appreciate all the questions we didn't quite get to, but we'll enjoy reading them later. And thank you as ever, Julia. It's great to be starting on this fairly big piece of work on truth telling that we'll be doing over the next couple of years. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.